just for a second, and then I'm going to close this with some comments from the mayor as well. This has been an extraordinarily helpful event. It's critical for us who play a leading role in encouraging research at a university like the University of Virginia to ensure that we're bringing multiple disciplines to the table. Too frequently we default to the supposition that a single discipline can solve something, right? And as soon as you bring in reality, communities, human communities, real places and real spaces, it becomes immediately apparent that a single discipline is never going to solve an overarching problem, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as a community that has economic networks, a community that has social networks, a community that's made up of real places with racial and economic and cultural divisions. So I'm enormously encouraged by some of the conversation about the capacity for gradual transition towards and market forces to be able to accommodate those things. But I'm also I'm coming away from today with some real questions about the responsibility of the public. What is the role of public institutions like the University of Virginia or city government, state government, and the federal government to step in and ensure public good and public access to these resources? And I think these are really critical questions. In the morning, we heard the essential responsibility of ethicists, and I think Camille returned to this again this afternoon. We must have ethicists at the table with software developers, right? Because software developers are going to be writing code that make decisions about how these cars function. Ethicists have to be at the table at the same time to ensure that those that code is making ethical questions about how to navigate questions of injury and life at the table. And I think it's really interesting to think about the ways that coding might actually begin to mediate against racial, social, and economic bias. David, you were suggesting this at the end here. It may be that that coding actually here could actually really be a collective social good, and that would be really interesting. It seems to me that there are some strategic decisions that I think designers need to help us move forward with, and engineers as well. How do we navigate the transitional season of the next 5 to 8 to 10 years? Many of you were asking questions, and I was very encouraged by what do we do next year? Like, what can Charlottesville do in the next 12 months to begin to experiment? That's exactly the kinds of questions that we want to ask, even if it makes the mayor sweat a little bit. It's good. He hasn't had enough of that. It's important for us. It's important for us to ask questions about action steps that can be immediate, but also to project necessary steps that will carry us forward for the next 5 to 10 years, this season of transition. And so I heard a great deal of emphasis on the necessity for multidisciplinarity and some creative thinking about immediate short-term steps. Before I give the floor to our final hosts and invite them both back up, both Paul and Mike, I wanted to just open the floor for a second. Did you hear a research question that you would want the university to try to pursue? And Cody here is going to be taking notes. So if you heard a critical problem that you want us to be sure not to miss, some intersection of questions, the floor is now yours. Yes, ma'am.
Mine's a political problem, and that's Omaha County. I don't see it.
So what's the question?
Will you please get Omaha County involved in this very important issue?
Okay.
Whether they want to be or not.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's critical that we bring a regional approach, not just a local government approach. I agree with that entirely, and there's no question about that. And in fact, I was chastised that on my way to the men's room as well, so you're not the first person to say this. This has come up before. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Yeah, this goes for the marginalized seniors out in rural areas,
Mm-hmm.
to be particularly isolated. Because the roads, especially in Elmore, are gravel and dirt, there are no line markings in 80 cars that go on them. So that is even more than a software problem if you need to have a line. So maybe it paint on gravel or something. But the rural area.
That's a great question. All right, I'm going to leave that for someone who may be able to answer that, because I certainly can't, and maybe it'll remain unanswered for the short term. But that's a great question. What happens when you move out of the more where you have weaker infrastructure in remote country roads. Other critical questions? Yes, sir.
I just take that a step further. You hear a lot of people talk about rural and urban in general, and you look at the political maps and what's happening in elections, and not just what you can do with autonomous vehicles, but what can the urban planning people do to make things, maybe move things out of the city into more like transitional rural areas. That the autonomous vehicles can then bring people in a shorter distance. Like you said, it's multidisciplinary. There's so many different pieces to the puzzle, but that seems like almost the key source of a huge number of the problems we're experiencing in our country right now, and the communication between rural and the ability to get to know people who are from different areas. And how do you put all that together into a research question where you can solve that fundamental?
Yeah.
It seems like the fundamental
Yeah.
problem in
Okay.
our society right now.
So some really creative, I think maybe even design work. I'm looking at Lucia here, thinking about some really creative design work that might be able to create infrastructures that bleed back and forth between city and county as a way of helping to break down some of those political and economic divides. I love that. Great. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I think probably like how detailed we can be able to personally request the car, like if you are going to put your child in here, like can you be able to be a car seat, and if you'd like to know this is specifically without the car seat actually like, or are you responsible for providing the things in the housing, so will that like be a meeting one with the rent or no?
Yeah, so certainly this final session, but it started to emerge even before the final session, the critical responsiveness. So much of the conversation, I think, on the national stage is about the transition of the Uber to the driverless Uber, right, which presupposes a healthy single individual, a healthy, fairly economically well-off single individual moving around an urban environment. But that's not entirely what Charlottesville is. And so trying to think about transfer of younger children, as you've just pointed out, how do these systems properly accommodate the elderly and the physically disabled, developmentally disabled? I think these are really critical questions that it may be there that policy and creative policy making needs to step in on that front to help substantiate that this is not just a system or a technology that's available for people like yourself and myself. There's a question just in front there. Sir, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I just wrestling with this issue of becoming dependency on this type of technology. What are the implications of this? That the bigger picture, for example, we had to evacuate Houston. We had to evacuate Florida recently. And in those situations, it's all one-way traffic going out. And that wouldn't work with Uber, or I'm sorry, automated vehicles. We have to bring vehicles in because there's not enough of those in these areas to export everybody.
Right.
And just the idea, and in terms of vulnerability, networks, whatever. That's what I'm wrestling.
Yeah, that's a critical question.
But then promotes dependency, and then what happens when the system breaks down?
Right. So Donna Chen in our third session actually was asking some of those very same critical questions, thinking through what kind of infrastructures would need to be in place for extraordinary conditions, not just the ordinary. How do we ensure health and safety in the extraordinary and not just the ordinary, which is critically important. One last other observation, a critical research question, or yes, ma'am, in the back.
This is a critical research question, but have they ever talked about having security cameras, video cameras in the driverless vehicle, especially for children, seniors, pets, and other people who need to be monitored, that they have people watching on the screen? I don't know how that would.
Yeah, that raises a really interesting question about both surveillance, privacy, but also security and safety. Absolutely. And there we need some policy interactions. Yeah.
The one that came up in the focus group that I didn't mention is how is priority, especially in emergency situations or really big event situations where the neighborhood or the city or the community is overwhelmed with need, how is priority identified?
Right. And that also becomes both an ethical question as well as a equity policy question. I think that's right. Yeah. And can you program priority? That's also another question. And that came up in our first session. Yes, ma'am. And this will be our final one. Yes, ma'am.
So I was just thinking about all of the questions everybody asks, is the safety one driving the car. How about bringing two technologies together? that person without talking to a real person, but acting like a real person? How about bringing different technologies together?
I'm sure people are beginning to think about that, but that's well beyond my pay grade.
Maybe the university has
Yeah,
that kind of
yeah,
funding,
absolutely.
bring different group of technology, the folks
Yep.
together to make it all solve more problems with one technology.
That's great, absolutely. All right, so with that, I'm going to ask Paul to come up. Is there anything to offer some kind of concluding comments, and then I'll ask Mike to come up as well.
Well, I like to tell stories, so I'll tell another one here today. So 12 years ago, ironically, on this very day, I was at the now historic 2005 DARPA Grand Challenge events that were being held in California. I was there with my first autonomous vehicle, which was built out of my basement, just 15 miles from here in Crozet, Whitehall, depending on where you consider that. The DARPA Grand Challenge, for those of you who don't know, was an event set up by an arm of the Pentagon where they held out a $2 million prize for someone who could build a fully autonomous vehicle that could race across the Mojave Desert over a stretch of 132 miles. No driver on board, no human in remote control, and it was incredibly ambitious for the time. This was 12 years ago. Just 1.5 years earlier, during a 2004 DARPA Challenge event, no one who entered the race even completed the course. The farthest any vehicle traveled was like 7 miles down the course, and most of the entrants faltered at the starting gate or just went a half mile or so. However, 1.5 years later, during this 2005 challenge, 5 teams actually completed the 132-mile stretch of desert terrain. It was amazing. It was a huge leap in autonomous vehicle technology in just the span of a year and a half. And before the event, during the opening remarks, one of the race officials proclaimed, "You are the material that will fill the history books that someday school children will marvel over. They'll be interested because in their family garages, there will be autonomous vehicles." And I led one of the 40-odd teams that were invited to the events in Fontana, whittled down from 400 and so initial applicants over the course of the year. We didn't have much money, maybe 1/100th of some of the bigger team purses. And at the time, it was just me writing software in my basement and doing some of the research and design and leading a small team of volunteers. And our focus was really on proving out the software that we had created in this architecture for autonomous vehicles. But we made it to the events, and we had built our first autonomous vehicle. And that was 12 years ago. And here we are today, 12 years later, not only forging a career out of this for ourselves at the company, but working with an auto manufacturer. And so we're well on our way to realizing the dream of putting autonomous vehicles into family garages. And when Google started making news in 2010 or so with their driverless car, the auto companies began upping their game, and the race was on for the development of the driverless car for end consumers. As traditional auto companies continued to struggle with determining which approach to take and different architectures to consider, other newcomer auto companies such as Tesla began throwing their hats in the ring. Even the Apple computer company has gotten into the game. Forbes technology contributor Chunka Mui wrote an article in 2013, which is a really fascinating article, by the way. I highly recommend it, titled "Fasten Your Seatbelts, Google's Driverless Car is Worth Trillions." And more recently, Intel Corporation predicted a $7 trillion market for autonomous vehicles by 2050. Intel purchased an autonomous vehicle sensor supplier this year for $15 billion. And I'm proud to say they made a small investment in us last year as well. But the stakes are high. This is a $1 trillion opportunity. Partially autonomous technologies such as adaptive cruise control and self-parking have already made their way into commercial vehicles that are on public roads today. But there's a fairly significant quantum leap required for companies to get to the ultimate prize of fully autonomous cars, which require no human intervention whatsoever. We call that level 5 autonomy. And the companies are scrambling. No one is completely sure which approach or approaches will win out. And as a result, there are enormous acquisitions occurring and huge investments. And with such money, coupled with the complexity of the problem to be solved here, There are unfortunately many questionable claims being made with slick marketing, looking to get rich, and some companies getting burned along the way. Nevertheless, with the money being spent, full autonomy is coming to a public road near you and coming fast. So it behooves everyone here and everyone in a community to become more aware of this because it affects all of us. And that's why forums such as this are so great. And that's why last year when Randy Castleman had suggested that Mike Signer and I talk about doing something local, I jumped at the chance. Mike already clearly was well read about this technology and understood the importance of driverless car technology, and was immediately interested in thinking about a local consortium with the University of Virginia to lead it. And we had discovered, too, that the University of Virginia had already been discussing this with a lot of thought leaders, this broader implications of driverless car technology for local communities. So it was great to see this sort of convergence of minds come together to bring together a forum like this, and with UVA leading the way. And I hope that this continues. I hope it doesn't stop here, because I think this is an incredibly important topic, and I don't think it will stop here. The benefit and rewards of driverless cars are just enormous. But so too can be the risks if we're not first made aware of what they are and if they're not properly addressed. Nevertheless, I'm amazed at how far we've come in the international driverless car community. And in over 12 years, just in my own small company as well here in Charlottesville, we've managed to create vehicles that drive to a destination wherever you are, see and avoid people along the way, navigate intersections, merging, pacing behind vehicles. And we're pleased to be doing all of this here in Virginia. Our specific region here offers prime conditions for the development of autonomous vehicles. We've taken advantage of the region's natural resources of affordable land relative to places like Silicon Valley, and for the establishment of test tracks next to a large workshop and an office. The region also has a tremendous natural local talent and, of course, a rich R&D environment at the University of Virginia. And for resource growth, we have the magnet of a beautiful college town and countryside complete with a panoramic mountain range, excellent cost of living, quality of lifestyle, and a happy populace that just makes living and working here on autonomous vehicles a dream come true. And what's more, the Commonwealth has one of the most favorable regulatory conditions for developing and testing driverless cars in the country. So the opportunity for growth under these conditions here in Virginia and our immediate region is extraordinary. And given the trillion-dollar stakes at hand, it's an opportunity that we not only cannot afford to miss, but it is also a new technology that we have to prepare for and accelerate adopting and leveraging now for the benefits of all of our citizens. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I just want to reiterate again, thanks to Perrone, Robotics, and Paul for being a private sector partner in this, the University of Virginia, the Office of the Provost, the Governor's Office, Secretary of Technology, and also the City Manager's Office. There are resources and partnerships coming in through all those to make this possible, and I understand it is being filmed, and all of this talent and discussion will be available to bigger audiences, which will be terrific coming up soon. So just to kind of close out this discussion, the cities are a very interesting place right now. It was said by Justice Brandeis a long time ago that states were the laboratories of democracy. In a particular way, cities have become a new kind of laboratory for democracies around the world. You've seen a lot of interest with the increasing dysfunction of the federal government and the log jams that you see. And this is not to discriminate against counties. Counties are wonderful places as well. But there has been a move back to cities demographically. So cities have taken a lot of energy and a lot of dynamism, and a lot of innovation are happening in cities. So when I hung out at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, for instance, there's a ton of energy around that new sphere of activity, and mayors are kind of seen as the front line of a lot of new ideas. That creates challenges and it creates opportunities as well. Cities like Charlottesville specifically, which are kind of hot cities, population is up 12% in the last 6 years, population value is increasing, a lot of attention, even when we don't have international scandals once or twice a year. There's a lot of attention to cities like Charlottesville, so people think about them a lot, and they move here, and they focus on issues in cities a lot. So to me, the two kind of frameworks that we're constantly should be looking at in a city like Charlottesville is innovation and equity. We're a progressive city. Our political values are progressive. There are plenty of cities that are not progressive, but that is in the social values of this particular town, political values. So what does that mean with the government and the policies and the society and the institutions we're creating? I can think of two ways that the prosperity and the dynamism of cities like Charlottesville can be addressed in the equity way. I think this was a fantastic panel to close out the day on. I really appreciated, Dr. Burnett, your comments, everybody's. One is that you can do what, not to drop a fancy, John Rawls said, help the least well off before you help the most well off. So if you have lots of riches flowing into your coffers from being a hot city, you help the least well off with those rewards. That is part of your design of your budget or the way that your government runs. Another one is that you just set the rules differently. So the rules benefit more people. They benefit marginalized populations. So either or both of those are a way to set up your social contract for your city so that you're living together well and you're being progressive in your values and in the track of your city. Just give you a quick example just from this last year. I think probably the thing I'm most appreciative of that we were able to do in City Council was double our contribution to the Affordable Housing Fund this year. We put almost $9 million more into the Affordable Housing Fund, which we were able to do because our revenues went up significantly because the city is doing quite well. And so we just last week allocated almost $2 million toward the direct creation of over 100 new units of affordable housing in the city of Charlottesville. That's a complicated thing to do. You have to work with developers who are experienced in using federal tax credits to make it last for 30 years. You have to have a plot of land that'll work in a 10-square-mile city. So none of this happens on its own. It requires care and tending, relationships. And I will tell you, it doesn't require even seeking credit a lot of the time because the amount of emails or phone calls that we got after we did this direct creation, I think is zero about the actual creation of those over 100 units of affordable housing. So there's a part of the discussion we're having now about what do we do as cities where the dialogue in the media sometimes can so far outstrip or can be so unrelated to what you're doing in government. There's a lot of hard workmanlike work that you just kind of want to do because it will be good for the outcomes you're seeking. It's not because it's going to work on Twitter or because there will be a lot of articles about it. So all of that brings me to the doorstep of this question. How do we deal with driverless cars? When I go to these conferences or talk to other mayors, this is described as a tidal wave coming toward us that is unstoppable. The amount of capital, the amount of innovation, the amount of voluntary people taking part in this sector it's going to happen whether we like it or not. So the question is, if it comes, how do governments and the communities in which they sit try and get it better rather than worse? That's the discussion we've been having today. And I think that the reason this was so valuable was we set this up, and this was Lewis's insight, I think, and was as questions, not as advocacy, not as evangelism for, futurism. It was, this will go a whole bunch of different directions depending on the questions we ask and the answers that we come out of it as communities and as governments that reflect the communities. So to me, I could go through the political challenges that we deal with already as a government of a 50,000 person city. Parking comes up constantly and it is really hard to deal with and it's expensive. We have parking requirements for buildings that are for zones. So we just put $2.9 million to the acquisition of a property near downtown because we have a parking crisis and we want to be able to build parking there. But if we build a parking garage in 30 years, if that garage's purpose is mooted or changed in some way by driverless cars, Do we build it differently now? Does it become more manipulable or changeable into something else? That's a capital question, that capital budget. That's a building architectural planning question. It really matters, and we could get it really wrong. Zoning, sustainability, transit. To me, so these all open up questions for us as a government, and but they create opportunities too based on our values. And that's why transit equity, which has been coming up a lot, I think that was the original question that we wanted to do this on. Progressive community, get this question right. Don't just be here as evangelists for millennials who want to be able to drink more and get, back and forth from their brewery more easily to their house. Who cares about that? The really interesting thing is, how could this wave be adapted to suit the social purposes of communities like this? And it is a real problem when somebody has 2 or 3 part-time jobs and a situation with a kid and a situation with a parent, and they live in the outskirts of town, and it's hard, and they can't afford, either they have a beat-up car, or they have to borrow one, or they can't afford their own car. Transportation is a huge issue for them, and it really sucks having to take a bus for an hour and a half between 3 or 4 different spots, and then go and take the bus to go do your shopping, go to the food line. So if this can address some of those problems, that was the originary question for this gathering here today. These opportunities we have based on our values to not just take this technology purely on its own, and that creates municipal opportunities, because we do subsidize transit, we do have public transit, we do have all kinds of public-private opportunities. Who knows how this is going to go, but I think that so many of the questions that were raised here, that's just the transit equity piece is one, but we got into all kinds of really important questions about the design of our city, the way that streets feel, the experience of somebody on the outside of these. How are we intending for Charlottesville to get a handle on this tsunami coming toward us in a way that will make our city even more world-class, even more attractive, and more charming? We're just ranked #1 charming city in the country. So claims credit. Also AAA bond rated, Virginia's lowest unemployment, a couple of, and spend money in our restaurants today. But so I just think that the benefits are, as Paul said, they are so sweeping and important for society writ large, setting aside cities like Charlottesville. Reducing 35,000 people not dying a year from these accidents, environmental benefits, erasing this excess of parking acreage that we have to have, that is huge, and then the opportunity for transit equity. But I think that we've talked about some really important flip side questions like the job loss that we're worried about. Some other big questions that I would add: what's the experience like of being in these cars? If the car becomes a pod, what do you do in that car? What's that part of your life when you're sitting in a car and it surrounds you? And how does that fit into our new lives? That's a very interesting question. But I think that for me, and where I end on this, is this still ends up in collective choices through governments, through social action, through the social contracts we have to live together as communities. And I think that this conference has not just asked a lot of questions, but provided a lot of folks here and people who watch later some beginnings of some answers to how we can collectively get the best of this technology for where we want to go as a society. So thank you all very, very much. I think we're right at 4 o'clock. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
And so with that, I will close this. These videos will be available for you hopefully within about a week on the website of the Executive Vice President and Provost of the University of Virginia. If you just Google the driverless future, asking the big questions, within about a week we'll have some content on there that summarizes many of the observations we've had today. Thank you so much for staying with us. I hope you all had a chance to ride in a car. I did not. Have a good afternoon.